Welcome to Faith Focus, where we delve deep into the richness of Catholic tradition, theology, and the lived experience of faith. In today's episode, we're going to talk about something that touches so many of us, mental health, and the struggle that often accompanies it. And what's more, we'll explore this through the lives of the saints, those who, despite being models of holiness, were not immune to deep inner struggles. Today we're focusing on saints like Saint Dymphna, the patroness of mental illness, Saint John of the Cross, who faced intense spiritual darkness. And we're also going to touch deep on how, when you teach children the lives of the saints, how it can impact how they walk through the world. So this episode was inspired by a homily one of our parish priests gave a few weeks ago, where he shared his own battle with depression. I was deeply moved by how vulnerable he was in talking about the very real struggles even priests face, battling doubt, darkness, and mental health challenges. And he shared something that really struck a chord. One day he confided in a priest friend saying, "When I die, I have a few questions for God." And his priest friend, with all the compassion in the world, responded, "Yeah, well, I have a lot to actually say to God when I die." And it sounded like it was full of pent-up frustration and doubt. And in that moment, it was clear that even those that are supposed to be the holiest among us sometimes carry deep burdens with unresolved feelings. So let's look at some of the saints that struggled just like we do. And we're going to start with Saint Dymphna and Saint John of the Cross, but we'll move beyond them as well, so stay tuned. So let's start with Saint Dymphna, one of the most well-known saints associated with mental health. Her story is heart-wrenching. Dymphna was born in the 7th century Ireland to a pagan father and a devout Christian mother. After her mother passed away, her father, suffering from immense grief and what today we would identify as severe mental instability, pursued a wildly inappropriate obsession with Dymphna. And I'm being very sanitized in my language, but you can imagine the worst, and that's what was going on there. So to anybody that is struggling with that, in their life, and we know that there are many, you might want to go to Saint Dymphna. Anyway, so she fled from him and eventually ended up facing martyrdom when he caught up to her and she refused his advances. Now, her life represents someone who suffered at the hands of another person's mental illness, but still remained steadfast in her faith. So if you are a victim in any way, secondhand because of someone else's brokenness, she is a good saint to pray to. But if you yourself are struggling with issues, you can do a novena to her. So you would just Google novena, Novena, to Saint Dymphna, and you would pray this every day for 9 days, asking for some kind of miracle. And hopefully intercession so that you can be spared and saved from this. Anyway, so today she is the patron saint of those suffering from mental illness, emotional distress, and anxiety. And her story speaks to us of the importance of mental health, not just as an individual struggle, but as something that can affect families and then communities. So when we invoke Saint Dymphna, we're reminded that God's grace is present even in the most terrifying mental storms. Even in moments of intense suffering, there is sanctification available. She became a saint. And sainthood is available to everybody. And her story brought me a lot of consolation as a child, even though, thankfully, I never struggled with anything even remotely close to what she was dealing with. And I was not struggling with mental illness, and I wasn't going through that kind of trauma, not even close. But you know, when you're a kid, you feel like your parents are the worst ever. And when you're raised by a Sicilian dad, they're notoriously culturally difficult to handle as parents. And mine came with an explosive temper. He never touched me, but he had an explosive temper, which often left me feeling frightened, even though he never hurt me. I was still terrified of him, many, many times. And when I learned about how literally disgusting Dymphna's father was, my dad looked like a saint in comparison. And I had this instant gratitude for him. And I realized that the negative aspects of his parenting were silly in comparison to what her dad was putting her through. And, so these are when sometimes when you're a kid, you're insulated by how awful life can be because you've never heard about it yet. You haven't experienced it. You don't have a social circle that has lived through things. So when you suddenly are presented with these realities through the lives of the saints, it's like getting into horror stuff really early. I remember being traumatized because I didn't know that dads did that sometimes, you know what I mean? Because mine would never. So I was so shocked by that, and it really shattered my perception of the world, but also, I believe, prepared me, to what to be watchful for. And that when I had friends that eventually later in life, confided that these things happened to them, I had a frame of reference and I could have an early compassion for them. So that's where sometimes learning about the saints is a really great thing. So this gave me perspective at a very young age that I could leverage the negative ways that I might see in the world, or maybe even by how people might treat me, as a means to be closer to God. And that gives me an abundance of strength, and has throughout my life when I've faced various villains along the way, as we all do. So these stories, empower you for what you might face in the future. Her father, even though he was the villain in the story, he also taught me an important lesson, because I learned that mental illness sometimes goes undiagnosed, like in his case, and the community wasn't there to support her, obviously, because she fled and he found her pretty easily, it sounds like, and there was nobody there to protect her, so she was martyred. So that taught me something, that there might not be people there to help you necessarily. And also, he taught me that grief can be a very serious trigger for someone that's unstable, and they could lead them to unthinkable acts. So it taught me to treat mental illness very seriously and to not dismiss someone's grief, because grief can have, the impact it can have on a person, is serious. And it's made me more compassionate and caring when I come across these things in people. St. John of the Cross, on the other hand, gives us a different perspective, one on internal spiritual darkness. Known for his profound mysticism, he wrote The Dark Night of the Soul. How many times have you heard that line, right? Well, that came from a Catholic saint, and that saint was St. John of the Cross. And that line continues to resonate with believers even today. So in his work, Dark Night of the Soul, St. John talks about a period of spiritual dryness where he felt utterly abandoned by God. Who hasn't experienced that from time to time in their life? And for him, this wasn't a fleeting experience. He went through years of feeling like this. So while it's true that the Dark Night of the Soul is more about spiritual desolation than a clinical depression, it has a lot to say to those who suffer from mental health challenges. It speaks to the moments where we feel completely lost, disconnected from ourselves and God, and where our prayers seem to fall into a void. I know that I have felt those periods in my life very profoundly. So his story is one that I can draw strength from. St. John's life is a testament to enduring faith, a faith that persists even when all tangible consolation has faded away. His resilience in the face of spiritual darkness inspires us to keep moving forward and to hold on to hope when we can't feel it. So going back to that homily I was telling you about, that priest spoke with such vulnerability, and it was a powerful reminder that even those we look up to for spiritual guidance are not immune to doubt and despair. His honesty about struggling with depression and battling feelings of doubt was refreshing, and it shatters the myth that priests, by virtue of their vocation, are somehow beyond the struggles of mental health. But let's just hope and pray that their leadership is sensitive to this and takes care of that individual, because the impact someone broken like that could have on a congregation, it could be a negative impact, right? If it's not dealt with in a proper way. So let's hope that there's proper order and formation when this sort of thing crops up, maybe even, later or mid-career for someone. That they're getting the strength they need so that they're able to continue serving their congregation in a positive way. But when I listened to him, what really stood out was how when he confessed to his priest friend that when he dies, he has questions for God. I think we've all kind of felt like that, right? We've had wanting answers, wanting clarity about moments in our life. Why? Why did this have to happen? Why is there suffering? And his friend's response was profound. I have a lot to say when I see God, which, that reveals a bit of arrogance, but, even those that are allegedly closest to God sometimes wrestle with frustration. So it kind of, takes the sting out of it, or a little bit, when we come to those moments too, right? That is a human moment. Even Jesus allowed himself that moment when he said, God, my God, you've forsaken me. And when we have these pent-up emotions, and sometimes we end up bewildered at the challenges we face in life, it's okay. And it's okay to even tell God that you're confused. I wouldn't be arrogant about it, but I would certainly cry it out to him for sure. What these stories show me, and I hope it does for you too, is that faith is not about having all the answers all the time, but it is about having the courage to stay in the conversation with God, even when it feels one-sided, or when we're in a period where we don't understand or in a lot of pain. It's about being honest with ourselves and with God, trusting that even when we're struggling, he's walking with us. And that reminds me of the Footsteps poem. You should have been walking beside me, and God said I was actually carrying you when you only see the one. I'm going to put that poem up here. Hopefully you can read it on the screen. It was beautiful, and I'm not doing it justice. So now let's talk about Mother Teresa. She's similar to St. John of the Cross. Mother Teresa, now St. Teresa of Calcutta, even though she's one of our most beloved saints of our time, known for her work of the poorest with the poor, she struggled, and many people are unaware that she struggled with intense spiritual dryness for many years. In letters that were revealed only after her death, she spoke of feeling abandoned by God. She described her inner life as a desert. But she kept going, though, and she continued her work for decades, all while feeling spiritually empty. And some might say that probably scored her some extra points. At least I hope it did. So how can someone so dedicated to the mission of God feel such emptiness? And if a saint can feel that, we're in trouble, right? Well, it's a question that can make us wonder about the nature of faith and resilience. And her life teaches us that faith is not about what you're feeling in the moment. It's about a commitment. It's a decision we make even when we feel nothing. Mother Teresa continued to pray, she continued to serve, she continued to love, all despite not feeling God's presence. In her life, we see that sometimes it's not about finding joy in the moment. It's actually, sainthood is about perseverance through darkness, trusting that God is present, even if he feels far away. And given that every single saint that I've studied has had moments like this, it almost tells me that it's a rite of passage to sainthood. That you have to go a period where you feel like you're walking alone, and that's where you're truly being tested. So now let's talk about something that's been a lifeline for countless people that are facing these mental health challenges, or any challenge, and that's prayer. And in particular, right now, let's talk about the Rosary. There's a reason the Rosary is sometimes called the enemy of anxiety. Its rhythmic, meditative nature keeps the mind calm and it centers the heart. As we repeat the Hail Mary and focus on the mysteries, we allow the worries to quiet down. The Rosary invites us into a peaceful dialogue with God, one that helps reset the negative stories that often swirl in our minds. Anxiety can be a powerful tool that the enemy uses to keep us distant from God. It distorts reality, and it fills our minds with fear and doubt. But sometimes all it takes is a simple prayer to break that cycle. Praying the Rosary reminds us that we're not alone, that Mary, our mother, is with us, guiding us to her Son. It reminds us that peace is possible, even in the midst of turmoil. From a Catholic perspective, mental health struggles don't mean that we're spiritually weak or failing in our faith. In fact, the Church teaches us that we're both body and soul, and caring for our mental health is as important as caring for our spiritual life. We're called to be whole, and that wholeness includes seeking help when we need it, whether that's through therapy, medication, or simply confiding in a friend or a priest. Religious practice, such as daily prayer, receiving the sacraments, and engaging in community, provides structure and comfort to those struggling with mental health. It reminds us that we're part of something bigger than ourselves, and that we're not defined by our struggles, and that hope is always available to us through God's grace. So as we wrap up this episode, I want to encourage anyone who's struggling with mental health challenges to know that you're not alone, and novenas to saints like Dymphna or John of the Cross and even Mother Teresa can help you face profound struggles and help you persevere. Their faith did not make them immune to suffering, but it gave them the strength to endure, and it made them a saint, and it can do the same for you. Remember, mental health is not separate from your faith, and it doesn't disqualify you from sainthood. It'll be part of your journey towards wholeness. So continue to pray and reach out for support, and trust that even in the darkest moment, God's with you. Sometimes all it takes is a small act of faith, like a simple prayer, to reset the story in your mind and remind you of the love that surrounds us. Thank you for joining us today on Faith Focus. I hope this episode brings you comfort and inspiration. Until next time, may God bless you and keep you in His peace.